So, the ding-a-ling-a-ling. Hello and welcome back. I'm Denny and this is my Sweet Oasis. This week we are going to be filming a how to make a birthday cake video. If you did not watch our video last week, then you'll probably want to go check that out before you watch this. Last week we filmed a reaction video to Gretchen's Vegan Bakery and how she made her birthday cake. And this week we're going to be making a birthday cake here at Denny's Sweet Oasis. During the reaction video last week, I kind of talked about maybe some things that I would do differently. So this week I am going to show that to you in case you are like me and you're a visual person, so you have to see everything laid out. So just so you know, I might reference some of that video. So the first step to making any cake is to actually bake the cake using your favorite recipe. And so this week I'm just going to use some cakes that I had in the freezer. And so I have one layer is going to be white cake and one layer is going to be spice cake. Unlike the cake that Gretchen made in her video, I'm only going to do 2 layers to my cake instead of the 3 layers. However, I'm going to mix it up and I'm going to use a couple different flavors. So this cake will be a little bit different, but it should still be really, really good. So if you watched the video last week, then you know what my thoughts are on using frozen cakes. So these cakes are out of the freezer, however, they have been thawed to room temperature. They are maybe a little bit chillier, but they are almost exactly room temperature. So now I'm going to make sure that they are the same height, and so you can either use a little measuring tape like I have here, or I prefer to use my handy dandy bench scraper, which I talked all about last week. This bench scraper has measurements on it from 1 to 6 inches. So I'm just going to use this because it's easier for me to just hold up next to the cake instead of having to like get down and hold the tape and make sure that I keep it level and everything. It sits right up against the counter and I know that I have the exact measurement of the cake. So this one is about 1 1/4 inches. And this one is just under 2, so we're definitely going to have to take some off of this white cake here. And if you saw the video last week, then you know my feelings on this. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to use this, and I can just change the height by squeezing the 2 legs together and then sliding the wire however I want. And it has markings from 1 all the way to 9 on the sides here to make sure that you get them on the same spot. As you can tell, I actually have my cakes on a towel. I do that because it makes cleanup a lot easier, because when I start cutting it, crumbs are going to go everywhere. And that way I just have to pick the towel up, shake it off in the trash, and put the towel in the laundry. So it is much easier than having to clean up cake crumbs, because if you have ever tried to clean up cake crumbs, then you know that it is not fun. They kind of smear all over and they get on the floor and then you step in them. So this just simplifies the process a little bit. So to go ahead and use this, like I said, I start by putting the cake on the towel, and then you want to make sure that the legs are on, oops, I got right in there. You want to make sure that the legs are flat on the counter. Now I have a little bit of a ridge on the edge of my counter, so to make sure that that doesn't change the height of the cut, I'm going to pull the towel in a little bit further to give me some room to spare. So I will now go ahead and put it flat on the counter, and then I will begin cutting. And I'm just going to use a soft sawing motion until I get to the other side. Then I'll slow down to make sure that I can get my hand there to hold and create some stability on the outside of the cake so it doesn't tear when the wire comes out the opposite side. So now that I've gone ahead and I've cut this off so that it is the same height as the other cake, then I am going to just pull this layer off. And as you can see, I cut the top of my cake. I didn't cut the bottom because the bottom is already going to be nice and smooth and flat because it was against the bottom of the cake pan. So you want to make sure that you always work with the top of the cake just to make your life a little bit easier. And this cake is the spice cake layer. The spice cake layer is already pretty level. I'm not gonna mess with that because it's not gonna be worth my time because it's already pretty level just looking at it. And if you haven't noticed, just like Gretchen, I do save my cake crumbs as well, and I do stick them right in the freezer. Once you get your cake layers all level and measured out, then we're ready to assemble the cake. So we're definitely gonna wanna use one of these, like Gretchen said last week, super important part. And then I love my turntables, and I would never try to decorate a cake without one. They make your life so much easier, and they protect your cake because you're not trying to slide your cake around, and it just lowers the risk that you're gonna accidentally break your cake. So I'm going to start with the white cake on the bottom layer. Before you ever put any cake on your cardboard, you want to just put a little bit of frosting. It doesn't have to be much. This will just help keep your cake in place, and it'll keep it from sliding around. And then you can just kind of smear it around a little bit with a little frosting spatula. This is the size of frosting spatula I like to use. I rarely use anything larger. I like Gretchen. Now I always take the cardboard and I put it on the cake, and I always put the top of the cake down unless something drastic has happened or I'm like completely spaced out of it, because the pretty part of your cake will then be up, and that's the part that will be easiest to frost. We do have a bit of a battle wound here. If you can't tell, there's a little bit of a crack there, but that honestly, it won't matter when we get our cake assembled because the frosting will hold that together. And I'll show you a necessary step that I use that will definitely help ensure that that will stay where it needs to be. So I'm just making sure that I get it centered on there, and it's not centered at all. It'll just make it easier if we get it centered to begin with, because it gets really tricky to center a cake on a cake board once you get frosting involved. It's probably about as centered as I'm going to get it just from eyeballing it. So now it's time to add our filling. I am not going to use the same filling that Gretchen used because I'm using a different flavor of cake. I do love ganache though. Kind of like Gretchen, I'm going to use some leftover Swiss meringue that I had in the refrigerator. This is some salted caramel, which will pair nicely with the spice cake. And just like she talked about, I did put it back in my mixer and I mixed it up for several minutes and got it re-aerated so it's nice and fluffy before I put it on my cake. I am not going to use this for the outside of my cake though, I'm only going to use it for the filling. So to make sure that my cake is nice and stable, and to make sure that the frosting that is around the edge of my cake is the same as what's on the outside of my cake, I am going to make a rim of buttercream, my regular buttercream. Unlike her, I don't draw it around, I just spin the turntable and hold my hand still instead of moving my hand like she did. It doesn't really matter, it's just whatever you prefer. I guess it's the lazier version, I don't know. If there's any spots that are thin or like lower, then I do go back and I just kind of fill it in a little bit more just to try to keep it as uniform as possible. Then we're gonna go ahead and we're gonna put our filling in. So I do typically place a grippy underneath my cardboard to make sure that the cake does not slide around, so I'm going to go ahead and do that. Now we're good. I do like to make sure that I get the filling nice and flat and as level as possible. That will help ensure that my overall cake is pretty level. So now I'm ready to put the top layer on. And you just try to line it up as much as possible. It's sometimes really difficult, but we just work at it as much as we can. If you do mess up putting the top layer on top of the filling, it's not a huge deal. You can kind of scooch it if you just place your hand on one side of the cake stand and then just kind of like gently nudge it. I did get this fairly even, so it's not a huge deal with this cake. But then once you get it lined up, you do want to give it a little bit of a press just to make sure that it stays in place and it really sticks together and gets rid of any air bubbles that may be in the buttercream filling or any filling that you use. So as you can see, I did a good job of getting the buttercream around the edge of the cake so that it's in line and kind of sticking out a little bit. This will help ensure that the cake does not bulge as much if you have the buttercream kind of sticking out a little bit further than the edge of the cake once you get the layers put together. To make sure that that really is the case, I love to take the same piping bag that I used to put the ridge or the buttercream filling in the middle, and then I just kind of place it up against the edge of the cake and I just kind of squirt some in there. Any spots that seem like there's a little bit of a divot, I put a little bit extra. This is not a necessary step, it's just one that I have found to save me time later on in the decorating process. And then you also take it and go along the bottom and just squeeze gently. You don't have to put a lot, it just helps to fill in some of those gaps before we start putting our crumb coat on. So now that that is there, I also like to smooth it out a little bit with my frosting spatula. This will also help me to check and make sure that the cakes are in line. And it'll help get some of this extra frosting out of the way for the next step. Again, it is an unnecessary step, it's just one that I have found saves me time later on. And it's important to get the nice and stable frosting in these places on the cake. That's why I found it to help me out, because the crumb coat, we want to make it nice and thin so that it goes on thin and so that it doesn't tear any of the cake, because with the cake recipes that I use, I do tend to have a little bit delicate of a outer layer on my cakes. They get a little bit of a caramelization where they bake up against the cake, and I do flour my pans, so that's also partially the flour that I put on the pans that bakes onto the outside of the cake. And so sometimes that can get delicate, and if I use too thick of a buttercream to do my crumb coat, then it will start to tear that off and it just gets really messy, and then it's just not fun to deal with. So to help stabilize my cake as much as possible, I like to use the stiffer buttercream in these important places, such as right here in the filling layer between the two cake layers and the place at the bottom of the cake. Anywhere else is not a huge deal, but those are the places that tend to need the most stabilizing with the cakes that I work with. So now it's time for our crumb coat. You heard me talk about this last week, so this is my magic tip that I am in love with. So I just take it, put it in a piping bag, and then I twist it. And like I said, this is some nice and thin buttercream. So I will start out by placing the teeth right up against the cake and then squeezing out the frosting as I turn the turntable. I want to make sure that those teeth stay right up against the cake to ensure that the frosting is stuck on really nicely. I also want to make sure that we get the buttercream up and above a little bit, and you'll see why in the next step. For the top of the cake, I just take this and I squeeze some out right in the middle. And this is where I do use my frosting spatula instead of my bench scrapers on the top of the cake to get it smeared around. I just found it to work quicker for me. To put your frosting on, you want to make sure that you don't dig into the cake, and you want to make sure that you just kind of glide the frosting onto the cake gently. You don't have to be rough. So to use the bench scraper, you just take it and you hold on to the handle, that's why it's there, and then you want to rest it against the cake board, or if your board is smaller than your cake, if you're trying to build a tiered cake or anything, then you would place it against the cake stand. And you just press it up against the cake gently, and you just spin your cake stand. You don't even have to move your hand. Alright, so that's pretty good for the sides for our crumb coat. So now I'll just take my frosting scraper and I will smooth this out onto the top. This is the crumb coat, so it does not need to be pretty. The whole purpose of a crumb coat is just to get some frosting on your cake that doesn't have to be perfect. So that way when you put on your final coat of frosting, you don't have to worry about any of the crumbs flaking off into your frosting and it impacting that overall look. It also helps to stabilize the cake, especially if you have any tears or cracks in it, just like I did with my bottom layer. It will help kind of glue it all together. I do like to try to create a pretty decent edge though on my crumb coat, just so that I have a nice base to work off of with my final coat. And I don't like to have a very thick crumb coat because then I think you can get way too much frosting on the cake just by accident when you're putting your second coat on and you've already got a pretty thick first coat. So that's just a rule of thumb that I do follow. Unless I have chocolate cake, then I do tend to make a bit of thicker crumb coat because chocolate is darker than white or even spice cake, and it does show through the frosting pretty easily. So that's a pretty decent crumb coat edge. Like I said, it's not perfect, but it doesn't have to be. So I'm just a bit of a perfectionist sometimes, and I have to tell myself just to stop because otherwise I waste time trying to make something perfect that doesn't have to be perfect. So there we go. Now I'm gonna let it sit overnight and really get hard so that it will really, really, really glue in the crack wherever it may be along this bottom layer. So I let my cake sit overnight and the crumb coat has gotten nice and hard. It has a nice stiff crumb coat over the top of all the crumbs in the cake, and it has given it a nice structure so that it doesn't undermine any of the integrity of the cake once we start applying more frosting or decorations, and it'll keep the cake from bulging out where the frosting is between the layers of cake. So now that we have that nice base, we're able to start building off of that, and we're able to add our final coat of frosting. So I'm going to add my final coat of frosting just like I did my crumb coat, and I use my bag with the same exact tip. And I also will use my frosting spatula to smooth out the tops and any small detail areas that I want to work with. And then I will use my bench scraper to get the sides nice and smooth. And then I will show you my favorite trick that I use on every single cake to just make it look as smooth as possible. After putting all of my second layer on my cake and smoothing it out as much as possible without taking too much time, I have left it sit, and it has sat probably about 15 minutes. And so I'm going to take my pinky and I'm just going to gently lay it on the frosting, and nothing came off. So I know that the top is ready. Now I need to check the side by doing the same thing. The side does take a bit longer to stiffen, so you do always want to check the side before you begin using the parchment paper. So I cut just a square of parchment paper, and you don't want it too big, or sometimes you'll accidentally, like a corner of it will catch the frosting and it'll create a crease where that cuts in. So I like to have just a small enough piece that my hand can do what it needs to do, but it's not so large that I'm going to lose control over where it's at. You can also use a paper towel to do this method. The paper towel, especially if it has any print on it, then it will leave marks and designs, which is sometimes an added bonus. Like if I'm trying to do a denim look on a cake or cookies, then I will use a paper towel to give it some texture, and then I'll airbrush over that and it looks really, really nice. This is one of my all-time favorite tricks that I use. So I'll start with the top, and you just place the parchment paper down, and then you'll just use the heat of your hand and just gentle pressure, and you'll just kind of massage the cake wherever it's got rough spots. And if you have any places where you're planning on putting designs and it's a little rough, then you don't really need to mess with those spots because that's going to be covered up with any of the designs or lay-ons or anything that you're going to be putting on the cake. And if you do wait a little bit too long, sometimes it will kind of get more of a cracked appearance to the cake because the frosting has hardened a little bit too much. So you do want to kind of watch it and don't let it sit too terribly long. Thank you for joining us today. And if you watched last week's reaction video and this week's video, and there were techniques that you used that neither Gretchen or I covered, then please leave those in the comments because I would love to hear the techniques that you guys use, and I love finding new techniques, especially if they speed up my process. So remember to like, subscribe, and hit the ding-a-ling-a-ling. Have a good one.